What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. It is my pleasure today to be joined by Dr. Anna Valdes. Dr. Valdes, how are you doing today?
Very good, Mike. Thank you very much for having me over.
It is my pleasure, and I'm super interested to get into our topic of discussion today, which is a recent research paper that you and your team were a part of titled Human Postprandial Responses to Food and Potential for Precision Nutrition. This paper, in my opinion, was a substantial contribution to the field of precision nutrition, which is a realm within this sphere that is increasing in popularity, especially over the past 5 years or so. As we all know in this field, we are currently in the midst of an obesity crisis of sorts. So as we attempt to attenuate this issue and improve things, there is this growing interest in individualizing the diet in order to optimize the results that we get from these dietary interventions. Can you provide for the listeners just a brief background of the paper, what spurred the idea behind this, and the trial that we're focusing on in the results?
So this study was originated in conjunction between investigators, mainly at King's College London, where I have a joint appointment with Professor Tim Spector, and then a new formed company, a biotech company. They came from the world of artificial intelligence and that kind of thing. And they thought, can we predict nutrition? Can we predict a person's response to nutrition? And can we do high quality studies? One of the issues that we have had in the field of human nutrition is that studies tend to be small, tend to be 10 or 20 people, very limited interventions. And so the results are not necessarily generalizable, or there might be even smaller or larger, they apply to very specific diseases. So people with diabetes, or people with this, or people with another. And here the idea was to understand in healthy individuals, how much can we predict of their responses to food, and not just their responses as in their glycemic responses to food, which have already been explored in a large study in Israel published in 2015, but also to look at other things like insulin and fat responses. So one of the issues is that we spend most of our day in a postprandial state, unless you're doing intermittent fasting, which is not necessarily most people. Most of the day you are in a postprandial state. To give you an example, if you have something with fat in the morning, it's going to take 6 hours for that to clear, depending on the amount of fat, but it can take 6 hours or even longer for it to clear from your blood. So can you imagine if you have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, how many hours you have had a higher elevated level? Now, the sugar goes down admittedly quicker, but most of us get sugar constantly. We can try to change our diet not to have those peaks and dips of sugar, but most of the day we're in that state. Okay, but this is different between different individuals. Not everyone has the same peak, not everyone has the same dip, not everyone stays in a high state all the time. And we know that this affects health. This affects your risk of heart disease, of diabetes, of being able to derive the most benefit from exercise. So can we describe this in a general population, and can we describe this in a vast group of people, healthy, normal people? And that is the basic starting point for the PREDICT study that we published a few months ago.
I think what is so fascinating about this trial is that, as you mentioned, the individuals we're looking at, they are objectively healthy people. And when it comes to nutrition research, because there is this deterioration in the general health of the public, we're usually focused on those who are already burdened by chronic diseases. And that leads to another point that some of the listeners might be curious about, is that why are we concerned with the postprandial responses in healthy individuals? They might know that, well, for type 2 diabetics, it's very important to monitor the glycemic response based on their day-to-day function. This can have important implications. But in somebody who has a normal fasting glucose, why should we be concerned with their postprandial glycemic responses? What's the data there in regards to long-term health outcomes?
So it's not just glucose, it's other things. It's also insulin. So in terms of things that are well accepted that we know is that your level of insulin after 30 minutes of eating, how high that is determines how much weight you're going to gain in the next 10 years. That has been done and demonstrated. And that's insulinemic response. It's not glycemic response, but that has been shown. And that is a group in Harvard, David Ludwig, that has shown this. So some people argue that that might not be the case, but basically even genetic studies have shown that if you have a higher susceptibility to generating high glucose at that time point, at that 30-minute time point, then you're going to have a higher weight gain. So overall, if you want to stay thin, that probably matters if you're healthy. The glucose is much more variable, your glucose response after a meal, than your fasting glucose. And you can have normal fasting glucose and have a huge peak, and then have a huge dip, or have a normal peak and then have a huge dip. All of those things are going to affect how hungry you feel after a meal, how much you're going to eat. And also, if you have high levels of glucose, you have more likelihood of developing insulin resistance, more likelihood of developing heart disease, and more likelihood of a number of problems that come from higher glucose. Just to come, it's to a completely different field of study. One of the things that we know that affects people having a worse or more severe response to COVID-19 is high glucose at the time of admission. So if people come to hospital diagnosed with COVID and they have very high glucose, now this is not postprandial glycemia, this is stress hypoglycemia, but it's linked to how your glucose is regulated. People with high glucose have a much higher chance of ending up in the intensive care or even of dying of COVID than people who have low glucose when they go in. And it is because the virus uses the high glucose to hide and to evade the immune response. So our glucose responses are not just a matter of preventing diabetes. It goes beyond that. So having a healthy metabolism, and in fact, one of the things that has to have come out with COVID is that obese people are at much higher risk of severe forms of COVID than healthy weight individuals. So there you have something. Why do you want? Well, one good reason for good glycemic and metabolic responses is to have a strong immune system, and I'm convinced of that.
Excellent.
Although, as a disclaimer, our study did not go into investigating immune responses. There is enough evidence in the literature to justify that.
Excellent. And as you mentioned there, we are concerned with other things besides the glycemic response, in particular with insulin and even triglyceride levels. But in terms of practicality, the glycemic response does seem to be something that we're able to practically measure. And before we dive into the various factors that we looked at, which affect the postprandial response, can you just provide a concrete range in regards to since healthy individuals can vary substantially in their postprandial responses, what would be considered a healthy range following a meal and potentially the time course for that?
So it's what is normally taken to be impaired glucose tolerance is not on any meal. We give people what is called an oral glucose tolerance test, and this is something that is done to measure diabetes and to measure pre-diabetes. And so if people have, I believe it's over 7.6 millimole per liter, or I believe it's 7.6 the cutoff, after 2 hours, if they still have that level of glucose, then it's considered impaired glucose tolerance, and that is a state of pre-diabetes. Between that and of the people that we measured, I think we had, I don't remember the exact number, but we probably had about 15 or 20% that had impaired glucose tolerance, having selected specifically people healthy between the ages of 18 and 65, with no diabetes, no gestational diabetes, none of that, right? So having selected healthy individuals, we still had a fair amount of people who had impaired glucose tolerance. Another way of measuring if people are pre-diabetic is, of course, their levels of glycated hemoglobin, And again, looking at our group, we had I think about 25% who would qualify by American Diabetes Association levels as pre-diabetic. Even those who are not pre-diabetic, there's a huge variation. So even if you have a healthy glucose level, even if your glucose level does not qualify as pre-diabetic, and you'll say that's a fair range, you would still want to have it at a steady state, at a not huge level of variation. One of the things that has been suggested as predisposing to diabetes is not just so much that it goes very high, if then it can go down and stabilize, is having constant variability in glucose. Having these ups and downs is one of the things that has been suggested as a risk factor. Having very big excursions in the levels of circulating glucose is not considered to be good. So it's more complicated than just saying, oh, if I'm above this cutoff or below this cutoff. It's trying to do something to stabilize that. And that's something that you can do, and that is not about taking a drug, right? If you eat things that are not going to give you huge spikes, hence the need to understand what gives you a huge spike, and are there things that can give you lower spikes, and are the foods that give people spikes of glucose or dips of glucose the same for everyone? And that's the point of what we're trying to investigate.
Awesome. I think that is definitely a sufficient background for why this matters and why healthy people should be concerned with monitoring their responses. As you mentioned, the subjects in the study were healthy, yet there was a percentage of them who had impaired glucose tolerance. And that's a risk factor, right? And unless you monitor that, you would never know. You would just always think, well, I'm perfectly in good health and I'm managing risk, but you could manage risk even further if you're aware of these factors. But with that being said, Dr. Valdes, let's kind of dive into the nuts and bolts of this paper. And just to open the conversation with a pretty overview question, bird's eye view, you examined modifiable and genetic factors which influence the postprandial response. In terms of the overall research, what seems to be more important here? How big of a role are genetics playing, and what is the role that modifiable factors are playing? Which one should we be more concerned with? Obviously, we have more control over modifiable factors, but is there enough control there that we can really mitigate any potential genetic risk?
So one, as you say, one of the first things is that you're not going to be able to change your genes.
Mm-hmm.
So even if the effect was huge, if, for instance, one of the traits that is determined hugely by your genes, mostly by your genes, is your height. And in fact, there's nothing you can do about your height. Right? I mean, realistically, that's the situation. So what we found is that for glycemic responses, some of it is explained by your genes, most of it is not. And then when we try to predict the proportion of variation, and for the lipid responses, most of it is not explained by your genes. We found a teeny possible effect of genes. Nothing, I mean, you could discard them and not lose any information for your fat responses to fat. So, but it's for sugar that if we're just looking at glycemia, there is an effect of genes, which when we put it all together was maximum 9%, but some of that could be accounted by other things. So you could actually, the negative effect of the genes could definitely be overcome by other things. The main effect in glycemic responses is the meal content. So what you put in your mouth is what's going to determine how high your sugar is going to go, and you can do something about it. Other things that affected your glucose response to the same meal, if you gave the exact same meal, would be what time of the day you're eating it, the sequence in which you're eating it, whether you slept or not, because obviously one of the things that happens is if that sleep alters your cortisol levels, and cortisol alters your insulin resistance and your gluconeogenesis, and the metabolism of glucose in the body is altered by cortisol. So lack of sleep, in fact, one of the risk factors, if you put people, I think this has been done, healthy individuals, you give them sleep deprivation for 7 days in a row, you get insulin resistance. So sleep is one of the biggies. And of course, exercise. So exercise alters insulin resistance, of course, peripheral insulin resistance, and that's why it's amazing when people are working out. That's one of the best things they can do. But also cardio exercise alters. If you have just had exercise, it's going to have a different response. The same meal, you're going to have a different response to that meal. If you exercise right after the meal, or if we're going to have 2 slices of bread, if I go for a 10K run, my glucose is going to be different than if I just woke up out of bed. Or if I eat the 2 slices of bread and go for a 5K run, my response is going to be different. All of this is going to dampen the response, the glycemic response, because you're using it and your organism handles it differently. So all of these things alter responses to glucose, and all of the things I just mentioned are things you can do about it. Another factor that contributed to it was the gut microbes. Not huge. For lipid responses, for your fat responses, the gut microbes really had a very strong effect. Lower for the glycemic and insulin responses, but still a significant and substantial effect. And again, those are things you can do something about it, unlike your genes, because your gut microbiome is enlarged. Also, the microbes in your colon, which affect your metabolism, not just of fat and sugar, but for a number of other things, they are modified by what you eat. So there's a number of things we can do to alter our responses to food, which depend on what we eat, and then exercise and sleep and time of the day and a number of other things.
I think that's going to be music to the listeners' ears, and the fact that the modifiable factors are most certainly way more important here. And there are things that you can do to control this postprandial response and improve that and decrease risk. Before we dive into some of those factors that you specifically mentioned there a bit further, as we transition away from the genetic part, I think it would be interesting for the listeners to hear some of the findings from the data on twins. So these are people with the same genetics, but in your research, you found that there can be significant differences in the response to the meals.
So we looked first at when we just look at the glucose responses, we looked at the levels of variation. How different is a response if we have the same meal and we give it to random people? To the random people, we give them the exact same meal. I mean, I take, say, 2 slices of bread, but really it was all muffins, and then we did different amounts of protein and carb and fat in those muffins. And so they didn't know which one they were taking. So if we give you the same meal today at breakfast and the same meal tomorrow at breakfast, you are most similar to yourself. Then next, you are most similar to your identical twin who shares all of your genes. And we find that people are much more similar if they share genes in their glycemic responses than to random people. And then there is similarity, obviously, between your response and that of another person to a, say, high-fat meal as opposed to a high-carb meal or to a pure sugar meal. So there, if we see how correlated they are, so the meal content is going to have the big effect that we just discussed. But by having a more similar response to your identical twin, your hypothetical identical twin, to someone who has your exact same genes, a clone of yourself, that's what identical twins are. And then next to that is a non-identical twin or a sibling. Because we included a bunch of identical and non-identical twins in our study, we were able to measure that. So we see that if you share 100% of your DNA with someone, you are more similar than if you only share 50%, which is what you on average share with a brother or a sister. And that's still more similar than if you don't share any of your DNA with them. So genes make a difference, but meal content makes more of a difference. So you want to keep a low glycemic response. It's much more important what you eat and how you eat it than your genes, or at least for healthy people it is. It might be that for certain conditions that's not the case, but we're talking here about healthy people in general.
Absolutely. And something again which we can't modify, but I think the information would be interesting to hear nonetheless. In this study, there was a focus on young, healthy European individuals. As we age, and perhaps based on different ethnic backgrounds, how can these things affect the postprandial response? For example, as we age, is it more common to experience a impaired tolerance to carbohydrate compared to when we're younger?
Not necessarily, but what is more likely to happen is that you will lose more muscle quicker. And one of the things that happens, I mean, this is just one study I was reading, is that if you take elderly women or women over a certain age, 70, I don't remember what was it called, let's say 70, And and they normally are active, and they have to stop being active for 2 weeks or 6 weeks, they lose muscle a lot quicker than, say, someone young. And what you get is insulin resistance or a loss of insulin sensitivity in the muscle. And you don't necessarily see a huge increase in inflammation immediately. As I don't know how familiar you are, but there is this thing called inflammaging. One of the things that happens with aging is more inflammation and just more metabolic inflammation. So while the diabetes and type 2 diabetes is not necessarily a disease that affects people in their 70s or in their 80s, it's not really like that. But having good metabolic health can prevent inflammation in your older age, and also can improve muscle function and muscle insulin sensitivity, which is fundamental to reducing inflammation. Muscle loss is one of the key markers of frailty and of aging. And so if you want to stay young, stay strong, you have to have muscle. That's just the reality. So I know I'm preaching to the choir here, and maybe the people who want to work out with you do it for other reasons, which they might be aesthetic or something else. But it's not just about aesthetics. So building muscle, it can have an aesthetic benefit, but it's not like a Botox injection that only has an aesthetic benefit, if you see my meaning.
Yeah, I think those are some super important points. I mean, whenever you're going to confirm our biases for resistance training, we love that on this podcast. But it is something that, I work with a lot of clients in the general population as opposed to strength and physique athletes. Even for these people, they might have no history of resistance training. They might not even really be aware of the benefits just outside of potentially looking better. So I think it's super important to get these points across, and that in terms of not only living longer, but improving your quality of life in the long term, resistance training is super important. And just getting in a couple of sessions per week can have massive benefits. Moving on into something that you mentioned, which is definitely the most important aspect of this discussion, which is the macronutrient composition of these meals and how they can affect the postprandial responses. You mentioned that within the same individual, at the same time of day, let's just say in the morning upon awakening, their postprandial response to the same meal is going to be pretty consistent. Something which is pretty interesting alongside this topic is that, say we take the same macronutrient composition of a meal. It's, for example, 50 grams of carbs, 25 grams of protein, 10 grams of fat. If we alter the foods within this meal, but account for the specific macronutrients and we equate for fiber, will the response still be similar, or could it significantly vary depending on the
Okay,
specific foods?
so number one, disclaimer, we didn't test that. That is food matrix, but the answer is yes. So I'll just give you an example. If I'm going to take orange and I'm going to make orange or orange juice. In the case of an orange, the sugar is bound inside the fiber. So a lot of this sugar is going to go with the fiber, with the non-digestible polysaccharides that go with that. And basically, I'm not going to digest that. It's going to go into my gut microbiome. It's not going to go for sugar. It's not going to go straight into my circulating bloodstream. It's going to have a lower glycemic hit, like an apple. Let's say an apple is probably an even better example. An apple or an apple juice. Apple full of pectin. I'm going to do apple juice, or I'm going to do an apple. The problem is that the moment you do the apple juice, most of it is going to be free sugar, so it's going to have a different response. If you now look at the content of the and macronutrient, you would call it carb. The pectin is carbohydrate. The pectin is, however, something that you are not going to digest. Your bugs are going to digest it and are going to transform the pectin into short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids are anti-inflammatory. They can help with a number of different things. There are receptors in our guts that receive them. Some of the short-chain fatty acids, one of the short-chain fatty acids called butyrate, actually is a preferred food of our colonocytes. And it's actually preventive for cancer, for colon cancer. So is there going to be a different response? You bet there is. Now, the food matrix, another example of food matrix, and it all has to do with this, with whether it goes straight into your stomach, digested into your stomach, straight into your bloodstream, or if it makes it to your colon, where the microbes metabolize it. Resistant starch is another example of that. So it's called resistance because precisely it's resistant to human digestion, and it ends up making it to the colon. So if, let's say that we bake lasagna, to say something, and that's pasta with a lot of fat, and we eat it straight away. Well, that's going to have mostly non-resistant starch. It's just going to be starch. But now I cool it and then I heat it, and then maybe I cool it and I heat it again. What happens is that a lot of the carb is going to form with the fat a kind of matrix that becomes resistant starch. It just gets a different chemical overall structure, although the basic blocks, the building blocks are the same. It's now in a different matrix. And so now a lot of that stuff that you're going to be eating, and the same happens with potatoes, whether you heat them, cool them, heat them again, or how you eat them. And this is something that is quite new, and that I think even food companies are considering how to make a good food, like not a good food, and a food that is tasty and that people want to eat and that feels very satisfying, and actually not being as fattening, because what's happening is you're not going to digest that. That's not going to go straight into your bloodstream. Your liver and your fat deposits is going to be metabolized by the gut microbes, and it might actually produce these short chain fatty acids, which are anti-inflammatory. So it makes a big difference.
Fantastic. And would you be able to elaborate a little bit more then on just in general the types of meals that were tested in this trial, and just the general effect of macronutrients and
So what
the postprandial response?
So what we tested here were pure glucose, the big oral glucose tolerance test, and then we tested a high carb meal, what we call the UK average, which included the macronutrients that are found in an average meal in the UK, and which is not very different from the US average, by the way. And that's basically high carb and has some fat and some protein. And then we did a high fat meal with about, I think, 50 or so grams of fat. And then we did a high protein meal and a high fiber meal. And then a few variations along that, but that's basically what we did. Now, what we found is that the lowest responses are obviously seen with high protein and high fiber. And I think that doesn't surprise most of us, and particularly people who are bodybuilding. You know what you're supposed to be eating, and it's not high carb, high fat. And high fat also gives lower glycemic responses than high carb and pure glucose, but also which are, by the way, our high carb was about the same as the UK average. So most people are actually eating a lot of carb in every meal. That gave a higher response. The other thing that we tested was for one of these meals, these UK average, and by the way, we gave them all with the same food matrix. So all what did was these muffins. So we just changed the composition of the muffin, what went in that, because that way it is not the food matrix that is being altered, and they were all the same amount of calories. So they were all about 500 calories, except the oral glucose tolerance test, which was 300 calories, or the test that we did in hospital, which was like a caloric bomb of 800 calories. So that was basically the study design and the macronutrients that altered it. The other thing we gave them was the UK average muffin at lunch instead of at breakfast. And we saw that the response at lunch is higher than at breakfast. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily because of the time of day. It might be the sequence of the meals and other things that need to be studied in more detail. But one of the things we saw was that if you had the exact same muffin for lunch, the average response, and we're talking about over 1,000 people, is much higher at lunch for that particular meal than at breakfast.
And in terms of chrononutrition and how the time of the day can affect our responses to the meal, you mentioned that at lunch you saw in this specific study that there was a worse response. I think from what I've seen from the literature, and you can touch on it as well, that definitely seems to be a case, especially when we start getting into the context of eating later at night and higher carbohydrate meals at night. Would you agree with that?
So I guess the question about the carbs at night is about whether you want to keep having carbs for hours and hours and hours, which is what's going to happen if you have carbs in the evening, and whether you want to keep stimulating an insulin response all day long, which is what happens if people start having a breakfast at 8 and then keep eating carbs until like 9:30 or 10 p.m. or something. Basically, they've gone on for however many hours with constant peaks of insulin. The issue, what we saw here is that if you had the same meal for breakfast, you would have a lower glycemic response than for lunch. That doesn't mean that you have a high glycemic response for dinner. Actually, it goes down again for dinner. But we didn't do it with this specific meal. We just saw on average, it seems to be that the highest peaks are for lunch. And we think it has to do with the amount of hours before you eat the previous meal. So you let a lot more time between lunch and dinner normally than between breakfast and lunch. That's, like let's say 8 to 12 versus 12 to 6 or 7, you have more hours. And also it might actually depend on changes in cortisol and circadian rhythms, which we're trying to understand. So it's more complicated than just, the later in the day you have the meal, the worse it is. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but there is something about time of the day and sequence of the meals that alters your response.
Awesome. And we touched on this a little bit briefly before we got this podcast started, but there has been some data, in particular the 2015 study from Zevi, looking at the response to specific foods. I believe you mentioned, and I saw that it was like in comparison a banana to a cookie, and that there were different responses here. But at the end of the day, these are pretty similar foods in terms of the glycemic index of them. Can you touch on this data and perhaps some misconceptions about how we should be applying these findings?
So what the study from Zevi and Duransegal's work in the Weizmann showed was that they had examples of people where you could find person 1 has a much higher response to a banana than to a cookie, and person 2 has a high response to the cookie than to the banana. Now, we do see some of these differences, but this is, it could be the food matrix, it could be a number of things. It's very difficult to predict that specific one. We didn't see many of those when there's a similar macronutrient composition. We saw some people had, for instance, a higher response to a high fat than a high protein meal, and some people had a high response to a high protein than to a high fat meal. So within very different macronutrient compositions, we did see some differences where, maybe you are better off having high fat than having high protein. But in the case of both the banana and the cookie, both of those are high carb meals, and basically just high carb, because in the case of the cookie, it might have also some fat, but basically that's what you have there. And also high carb and high fat only depends on the size of the meal, right? So if you would need to do this in a very specific way to say, what people want to know is, should I be eating bananas or cookies for breakfast? I would probably suggest you should be having a high fiber meal for breakfast and add some polyphenols to it, like some blackberries. But that's just my bias. I don't think you should be having cookies and bananas for breakfast. But if you wanted to do that, then you would have to do a proper study and test that, not just show an anecdotal evidence of 2 people. Show, in a number of individuals, this is the relevance, and this is how we can predict it, and this is what determines it. And I think that it is, in just an example of a couple of people, it is difficult to identify what are the determinants of that. They attributed most of these to gut microbes. In our own study, we find that gut microbiome composition explains at most 5% of the responses in the glucose. So the other 95% is not due to the microbes. And I would say that this would require a bit more in-depth study.
For sure. And I would certainly agree with your bias there. I do not recommend starting your day with some cookies, even if you apparently, tolerate this food well. Let's go for something else a bit higher in protein and fiber to get the day started. When we look at the literature on precision nutrition at large in this rapidly evolving field, what questions do we have left that still need to be answered? What really piques your interest in this field? And as you've looked over the data and conducted this study, what questions are
So
still to be answered?
I think there's more questions than answers. That's number one. Where unlike what has been happening in other fields of clinical research, I think nutrition has lacked the kind of rigorous, very large clinical studies that we have seen for, say, pharmaceutical research. And this is a weakness that we're trying to address now. So for precision nutrition, I think we need large studies where we have very deep scientific, good study design. That's basically it, and very clear questions of what we're trying to address. If we're going to try to find, let's say that the question was, what kind of protein will improve? If I wanted to personalize people's muscle strength, then that has to be an outcome. It would be nutrition in the context of muscle building or of resistance training. Then we should do that, and it's going to be different in women over 60 than in young men in their 20s, right? But if we wanted to do that, we would have to do it and say, okay, your gut microbiome, when you eat it, how your glycemic risk. So we need to design the study in such a way that is going to answer those questions large scale and collect lots of data. Because if you just ask about, is your glucose response good, but we didn't ask about insulin or lipid responses, if we didn't measure, for instance, sleep, in the case, if we were measuring what is going to improve your response to improve your muscle strength building, well, we would need to measure other parameters related to exercise, not just not just, whether we put more sugar or less sugar, or more carb, more fat, more fiber. It really needs to be more thorough. When we understand that what we eat, we are what we eat, and we don't excrete. That's what a person who has been working extensively, Professor Ryan from Colorado, says, and it's true. If some of it is what your gut microbes are going to do with it, and some of it is what your body is going to do with it, we need to understand that, and that's going to affect your health in all kinds of ways. You're putting stuff through your mouth and forget it. Well, that's just not going to work, right?
Absolutely. And I think, when it comes to the specific realm of nutrition, people are interested in this possibility of being able to be told that, hey, for weight loss, you should be pursuing a higher carbohydrate diet or a lower carbohydrate diet. And then even more so, if you're going to take one of these approaches, such as high carb, for you, these starch foods would be a better option than these. But unfortunately, we're just not there yet, are we?
No, I don't think we're there yet. What we're hoping to publish in the near future, because we have done the analysis, is to find what are the predictors of the glucose dips. What we have found is, I'm sure you're familiar that people have discussed that people have different responses depending on their neuropeptides, and that hunger is all regulated by your brain. Although we all know that hunger is a lot of regulated by what you have just eaten. And so what most dietary studies measure is your glucose within the 2 hours of eating it. What we did here, because we had the continuous glucose monitors, is then see what happened after 2 hours and how much it drops. And how much it drops depends on what was in the meal, among other things, but also on some individual characteristics. And the bigger the drop, the hungrier you will feel after 3 hours. The more food will people be eating between 3 and 4 hours after the meal. The more food they will be eating in overall during the day, and they will report lower levels of energy. They will feel less alert and lower levels of energy if they had this glucose dip. So one thing you could modulate is identify for people who are glucose dippers, to find what makes, so you wanted to lose weight, you could actually find not what makes your glucose go up, but what makes it go down under. So if you started at the baseline of, say, 5, you went up to, say, 8, and then after 3 hours, you're at 4.5. You're going to be hungry. It's because your baseline is 5. And whereas if we were able to give you something that didn't make your glucose go that low, but stay stable, even if it took a lot longer to go down, you would not feel as hungry. that's the kind of thing where personalized nutrition can help with weight loss, and what we're trying to identify and are working on right now.
That's absolutely fascinating, especially in terms of how this interest in intermittent fasting is rising, right? So, based on these points that you're mentioning, we could individualize the meal frequency of the diet to promote better adherence. And for one person, they might see on the internet that, oh, all these people have lost a bunch of weight using intermittent fasting and they only eat one meal per day or something. But for them, they might experience these significant valleys in their blood glucose, and that could be a recipe for disaster if they're pursuing weight loss
It,
for that
it, it,
individual.
it is, because although it's very easy to, when you're watching a YouTube video or reading and I don't know what, it's very easy to say, oh yes, of course, I am only going to eat 500 calories, and I'm just going to have this shake with 500 calories, and that's all I'm going to do. Well, the thing is that, we are flesh and blood, and you're going to be darn hungry if that's all you're doing. So you might be able to sustain that for a few days. Some people are able to sustain that for longer. And I'm saying some people are not. And some people are not because they just get very hungry. And maybe your neuropeptides are a lot, we don't know what modulates it, how you would modulate it. But one thing you could try to do is just understand that another issue I just want to say about this intermittent fasting, the idea is that you are controlling your insulin responses. And you're controlling your insulin responses by trying to modulate your glucose responses. Insulin responses and glucose responses are correlated, but are not one and the same thing. And so there are things that have very low glycemic index. An example is milk. Milk it has a bit of sugar because it has lactose, but doesn't have a high glycemic index. However, it has a high insulinemic index. So you can actually, and these might be different for different people. And if people are trying to keep a low level of insulin, and what's the problem? That we can measure your glucose, right? With a continuous glucose monitor, but we cannot really tell you your insulin unless we take a blood sample and do all kinds of different things. It's much more difficult. One day we're hoping that there will be insulin immediate markers like we have now for glucose, but until we get there, people have to be careful that they are confusing and they think, oh, if I just keep the glucose at this level, well, and then they are trying to cheat by saying, well, I am still fasting because I only have had these and these doesn't raise my glucose. Well, are you sure that didn't raise your insulin? And are you sure that didn't drop your glucose and that's not making you hungrier? It's part of the problem is that a lot of these diet advice is oversimplified, and there is inter-individual variation. So obviously, weight loss, if I had the secret for weight loss, I would be patenting it, but it's not as easy. I think that certainly works for a lot of people, and I'm very glad that it works for many people. But I don't think it's overly pessimistic to say that it doesn't work for everyone.
Yeah, I think that nuance and context here is super important. So thank you so much for sharing. I do really appreciate your insight into these topics. But that is all I have for you today, Dr. Valdes.
Thank you very much, Mike.
It was my pleasure. For those who are interested in learning more about you, maybe seeing your publications, where should they go?
Well, if they want to look at my publications, of course, they can find them on the website of the University of Nottingham, and they just type my name, Anna Valdes, University of Nottingham. If they want to know more about the personalized nutrition, this is really work that I work in collaboration with Zoe Global Limited. So that is joinzoe.com, joinzoe.com, and who are the company who did also this with this paper. And I think they will find lots of stuff. We have blogs and personalized nutrition, and they probably will find it quite interesting.
Absolutely. And those links will be in the show notes. But that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Hey guys, Mike here. If you're interested in learning more about how to maximize your health, body composition, and performance, head over to hammerawayfitness.com, where you can sign up for coaching or even just schedule an hour consult with me to get some of your training and nutrition questions answered. Also, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did and would like to further support the growth of the Muscle Memoirs podcast, you can give a donation to the link in the show notes, leave us a review, and or share this episode with your friends. whether that be dropping the link in a group chat or putting a screenshot in your Instagram story. I truly appreciate it.